Cornell A and Boston University. And I call upon the Prime Minister, Justin Berkowitz, to open the round with a constructive speech not to exceed 7 minutes.
Hear, hear.
Very much, Mr. Speaker. Everyone in the round, congrats to Rob for being a fabulous partner, and congrats to you guys for just what I think will be a great round, real friends. With this in mind, Rob and I are going to suggest a change in the way that taxes in schools work. And our proposal, our case statement today, is that rather, the way right now, let me just explain, under the status quo that schools are funded in most parts of the United States, is that local property taxes, which are assessed by school boards and like local county assessors, wind up funding schools. What Rob and I would suggest is that the state manages the taxing that winds up funding schools, be it through property tax or some other sales tax or value added or whatever they deem appropriate, but they determine what the taxes are and then distribute funding equally to schools or equally on a proportional basis to students. And the one caveat that we put in is in some places like electricity or water or utilities might be like, somewhat different in price, and they can correct for those differentials in price. So if, in a particular place, more money is needed for busing because fewer people can walk to school, obviously they'll get a little bit more money for that. But by and large, we want to see every school in the state have the same amount of funding per student. I just want to ask if there are any need to clarify.
Just a quick one. Are there other sources of funding that we need to be concerned with around? Is there federal funding we're concerned about?
The federal government gives block grants to states, so it's still
okay. So it's safe. Okay, cool.
Okay, sure, awesome. All right, Rob and I will make a number of arguments to this end. The first one is sort of a bit of rights analysis. And we believe, and I think American jurisprudence has firmly established, that we have equal treatment, that people are treated fairly. That's what the Civil Rights Act and Civil Rights Movement was largely about. But we also believe that there should be, and has been, equal access to benefits. So not just in the way that the government treats you, but in terms of allocating resources that the government gives to people, in terms of things like transfer payments, which would include medical care, like Medicare or Medicaid and welfare. We don't give one person a lot more money than another person simply because they live somewhere else. The fact that maybe I had a more affluent life growing up than somebody else doesn't entitle me then when I go on welfare to now get $100,000 a year from the government. We think that there's roughly equal distribution, again, in accordance with regional variances. But also like things in terms of protection from the government, like by the government. So the 7th Fleet doesn't just guard Rob's house because he might pay more taxes than I do, or he lives in a more expensive home than I do. The 7th Fleet, the American military, guards all of us pretty much the same, we think. It wouldn't be fair to have a type of unequal distribution of benefits and government services on that rationale. We think that the same thing should be true in education. In fact, there probably is not any place where it should be more true. Some kids, because they live in areas that have wealthy homes, that have tax rates that have been assessed appropriately, go to very good public schools. I went to an outstanding public school. Some people don't go to good public schools because homes in the area rob blind, which accounts for, actually doesn't account for Rob being 100 times smarter than me, but it's like sometimes schools just like blow. The taxes are very low, the people are very poor, they're not able to bear a high cost of taxation, so the schools are terrible. And it's just something actually that throwing money at it could solve. While you can't have perfect schools with more money, you certainly can have things like access to textbooks or access to more technology and computer resources, and thank you Amanda Whiting for banning that. I thought it was brilliant myself. But also, remember what the importance of education. I think it's important in terms of contextualizing this debate, because education is things like access to higher education and access to resources in the future. There are a lot of cases, and I think a lot of studies of poverty in the rural South show that it is largely self-perpetuating, that you have many generations of family that are welfare families, because it's very difficult to break out of this cycle. Education is probably, by and large, the one aspect of American culture that allows you to advance beyond a particular social situation. Maybe if you're a very effective entrepreneur, you don't need an education, but I think those instances are by and large very rare. But what we grant you in this case is the opportunity to allow people to get out of the cycle of poverty, where they can go to good public schools, where they're not looked down upon for going to a bad public school, where it's not immediately assumed by college admissions officers that they went to a bad school, but also that they just acquire the basic skills that they need, whatever those skills might be. Perhaps Joe Gallagher would like them to be more vocationally oriented, but you do have the opportunity to have those types of programs, even if it's not just to go to college, but to teach people auto mechanics, when you have a more fair and equal distribution of state resources. So we think that that's particularly more fair. It's also important to remember that I'll get to this before my argument.
Sure. Isn't it true, Justin, that the main problem with a lot of these schools isn't that they don't have enough money, but rather that the community isn't as committed to these schools?
Well, what do we mean by commitment, right? Parents being involved, parents picking up the slack for things, participating in things. A lot of times, you can't correct for that. But in a lot of cases, money can correct for that. If a community is not involved, maybe an after-school program gives kids somewhere to go other than being on the street. That's the type of thing that we have. And although we can't solve every problem, and we're not purporting that this case is 100% solvency, this is the answer to all of America's educational problems, we think this is an extremely tangible way that will certainly chip away in a substantial way at the problems that we experience today. So the second major argument that we make is, that we'd like to make is, it's not just that kids should have fair access to this from a rights perspective. But we also believe that the mechanisms that are used today are just inherently unfair. They're also not particularly well equipped to deal with this. Specifically, what we mean are school boards and local officials. Why is this the case? Well, school boards and local officials may not have the training necessary to understand what appropriate rates of taxation are. In fact, I think in a lot of cases they don't. I consider myself a pretty smart guy. I went to college. I don't understand appropriate rates of taxation. I think it requires special training that a lot of these people don't have, particularly in cases where school board officials make these types of decisions. This could be somebody that is active in the community. Maybe they're the coach of the football team, or they have a lot of friends, but it doesn't make them well equipped to deal with this. Although they might be able to understand community mores that can help shape education policy, like do we want to buy these types of books for our school, we think that they are very much uniquely not equipped to deal with the types of questions of taxation. So what's the paradox that results? Consider a poor rural area. Either you can set taxes very low, at which point you don't have funding for schools, you can't grant them the access to resources that these people need, or alternatively, you can set the taxes high, and I think this happens a lot as well, but what it does is increase an enormous burden for living in these areas on something like a poor rural farmer who's not able to bear the cost of increased taxes. It's not just that it's very difficult, it's a damned if you do, damned if you don't situation, but it's that making a change can impact either one of these things, and we think there's a substantial incentive for school board officials not to make a change, even if that change wouldn't have this impact, because it could be perceived as doing one of these two, damned if you do, damned if you don't types of things. But the other thing that we'd say in terms of these school boards is just the sort of comparative benefit that we grant on our side of the house. Because our comparative benefit comes when the state determines property taxes. Well, the state already does determine taxes. The state already does know how to collect taxes. The state already understands macroeconomic policy and the impacts of tax rates on general local economics. So we think that they are much better equipped than local officials to make these sorts of determinations. It's something that's definitely a benefit for them. It's something that the school boards we don't think are capable of doing. The very last argument that I want to close on are the types of bad incentives that we believe arise in these cases. The first of these is that it's very easy to tamper with school board elections, particularly when you're at a moneyed interest and school board elections don't have an enormous amount of funding or a lot of money involved in campaigns. I think in many places, people like Ed Rendell, who is, I think, the governor now of Pennsylvania, when he was the mayor of Philadelphia, he ran on local tax relief, particularly through property taxes. This negatively impacts schools, but because there's a large interest group of people who want to see their taxes lower, particularly the elderly or people without kids, they want to see their taxes lower. This results in a type of pandering that can result in a negative impact for schools. Also, we think school board elections, because the funding amounts are so small, they become very vulnerable to manipulation by giving a candidate lots of money for their campaign and that type of thing. But the very last thing that we'd say is, and I think this is probably the biggest harm of all, and the most concerning to me, is that what happens with wealthy people who live in areas where the schools are not good, maybe because of marginal tax rates, because the tax rates are too low, or the schools don't have enough funding. We think either they take their kids out of the school and send them to private school, which results in that sort of typical argument that comes from school vouchers, where kids have to go to a parochial school or something along those lines. They have no choice because it's the only alternative. Or they just move away. This can be just as detrimental because it further reduces the tax base. It reduces the number of people who are able to contribute privately to schools. Mr. Speaker and members of the panel, we propose.
The House thanks the Prime Minister for his eloquent remarks, and we now call upon the Leader of Opposition, the Right Honourable Nick Mendocino, to deliver a constructive speech not to exceed 8 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, members of the panel, everyone in mostly this House, Dennis for being super fantastic all weekend. Really good friends here on SiteGov for an interesting case. I've been joking all weekend that we were going to be the first free seed to win Nats ever. After hearing Kay's statement, I like our chances. Let's go green. I have 3 things I want to talk about. The first thing I want to talk about is why local voting is good, because local voting for school taxes is good because it leads to more local control. Here's how the system works now. Every year you vote, or at least the system we're going to defend. I think it's true in most cases. It's not true in all. We're defending this one. In most cases, the people in the local community vote on a school budget every year. That budget is itemized. They see how much is being made, how much is going to be brought in through taxes, how much the tax will be for the community, and what that taxes are directly going to within the school. Why is this good? Because different schools have different needs for themselves. So being able to see an itemized budget of what the school needs allows people to make informed choices about whether or not their school budget is actually what it should be. I'll give you an example from my own high school. We were right near a lake on Long Island. There were these birds, like seagulls, that were in the lake. They would pick up shells and drop them on the roof. This meant we had constant roof leaks in our school. Now, we had to spend a lot of money fixing the leaks in the roof. Other schools don't have problems like this. So if we distributed money equally by student, my school wouldn't get all the money it needs, or other schools would get more money than they need. That's a problem because local control allows you to solve that problem because you give the school the money it actually needs to fix their problems. Sure.
Okay, but it might very well be that your school needed the money for that particular project. But might it also be true that other schools need the money for different things? And isn't it unfair to prioritize your concerns at the expense of those schools to the point at which you're getting more money than they?
Well, yes, each school needs the money for different things, which is why we have each community make the decision about how much money they're going to give to their school. So, also, local voting allows for better actual tangible control of the budget, that you can better look at what the school is doing with it, make better control of what the principal is going to allocate money to, because you can go to them and say, this is what my vote matters in terms of you getting money. You can say, don't cut our music program, or I'm going to vote against the school budget next year. It allows more control, more check on the principals, more check on the actual school system. But the second thing I want to talk about, note that. The second thing I want to talk about is the idea of encouraging voting for higher taxes. This is sort of related to one. In terms of looking at that vote every year, I can go into the school and look at the school budget and say, this is what I'm actually getting for my dollar. This is what my child is going to get for my dollar. If I'm willing to pay $1 more in taxes, this is the benefit he's going to accrue. This is how the school gets better. This encourages people to vote for higher school board taxes because they see what's actually going to be benefited to them in their community. This means we get more money into schools by having local control. When we separate the interests, now parents who are going to vote for the school budget, or just concerned citizens, like I've always voted in favor of my school budget, these people go in and don't know that their dollar is necessarily going to a tangible good. It's going to some pooled fund that could be pulled off in many different ways of like government work. Now I'm not saying it's going to happen, but people will perceive it to happen. This means that they're going to vote for lower school taxes, and we get lower money in the system overall. The simple relation of my dollar goes here is a good. But the third thing I want to talk about is that money isn't really the only determinant factor of whether a school is good or bad. This is something Dennis alluded to in a point of information. The fact is, the community that breeds this school, the community that breeds in a culture of education or a culture of non-education, whatever you want to call the sort of urban districts that, some of you judges are from Fordham, you've probably seen some of them walking around the Fordham area. These sort of urban areas that don't encourage cultures of education. The question is, what community is there in the system? Money doesn't solve that problem. Now the problem is they're going to say money could solve something, right? They're going to say money does something for you. The problem is when the rich people in society have given more money to these communities, have had their money reallocated for them, it makes them feel that their burden to help these people has already been alleviated. It makes them feel like they don't have to do any more. The problem is we want them to go out and do more. We want them to try to do other things, like people volunteering for Teach for America or going to work in community centers or this kind of thing, hiring people of lower income because they did have less means. I think those are all things that become less impactful when they feel like they've already done their duty. Sure, Rob.
But Dennis, yeah,
I'm Nick.
I know that. Isn't this an argument against any kind of redistributive policy? That rich people will think that because they voted for welfare, because they voted for people who support any kind of redistribution, they paid off their debt.
I think it applies to a lot of them. The problem with this, with a lot of the ones you mentioned, is that it's sort of necessary because you couldn't really have like a sort of a system in other places. Now, I would say that perhaps local funding of welfare wouldn't be the worst thing. I think there are more problems with that. I think it's a situation for another debate round. Rather, I think the argument I've made still applies here. Let's go back case study. The first thing Justin tells us is rights, and how equality is necessarily paramount. The thing is, we want to grant everybody equality of opportunity. But at the same time, we say you get to use the items you have at your means as sort of your impetus to have that equality. We don't say you have to retard other people's development to promote yours. Or we don't say we're going to retard your development to promote others. These people who are more affluent, who live in the more affluent communities, should get the benefit of the hard work they've done to earn their money. Otherwise, it's not fair. No thanks. Remember, we still have federal sponsoring of schools that can still be distributed in the right way, which solves for a lot of the money problems they're talking about. They say that the next thing they say is that the money level isn't equal in all the schools. That's true, but we can solve for that better with federal grants given to schools that actually need them, right? Also, I'd make this point. Consider that a lot of the poorer school districts, particularly in urban areas, have higher funding than good public schools. Consider the Boston area schools, which I happen to know a little bit about. The Boston area public schools are better money per student ratio than a lot of the better public schools. But they don't have better performance because the community is bad. The problem is not with money, the problem is with the community. If that's the case, I'd say wasting money in schools where it's not going to get as much tangible benefit as in the other communities, it's silly to do, rather not waste money. Then they say education is the way to break out of the downward social spiral. I don't think this is really meaningful to the case. So, like, we all agree that education is important. That's why we have other means for this funding. I think this is an ineffectual way to do it. No thanks, I got a little cover. Then they talk about having more actual programs for people. Again, I think there are other ways to get those programs, and I don't think those extra programs are necessarily the essential parts of education. The second thing they say is the mechanisms that school boards aren't equipped to handle. School boards don't understand complex tax law. Well, maybe they do, because some of them are lawyers that ran for the school board, right? But I'm willing to accept that a lot of them don't understand complex tax law. But understand, the school budget is not complex tax law. It's, we need this amount of money for this year. Then you put it on the school budget vote every year. It's not a complicated issue, it's a 1-to-1 ratio, no effects. He says that the state understands the tax system well. It's true that the state understands the complex tax system well, but they don't understand the local needs as well as the local schools do, since each school needs a different amount of money, not necessarily based on students, but based on particular circumstances. The third thing he says is bad incentives. These are sort of some weird arguments. I feel like they're almost throwaway. He says people are going to run for elected officials are going to run based on lowering school taxes. This seems to be something that can happen on either side of the house, right? If it's state funding, they'll run for state offices on lowering school funding, and now it affects more kids when they actually win. No thanks, you're out of order. They say it's a small amount of money, so there leads to be more abuse from it. I don't actually see a causal link here. I think smaller amounts of money are easier to keep track of, particularly when you have an itemized list. The last thing they say is the wealthy are going to send their kids to private school and sort of steal money out of the system. I don't think they understand how this works. You send your kid to a private school, you pay for the private school, you also still pay school taxes. So, when people send their kids to private schools, it means there's more money per student in the system, not the other way around. Ultimately, I don't think money is the only factor, and I don't think redistributing money is going to necessarily solve all the problems of the education in the bad schools. But even if you think it will, I don't think this is the proper way to get more money into the system. It hurts the system overall. For that reason, I'm proud of it.
The House thanks the Leader of Opposition for his eloquent remarks, and we call on the Member of Government, the Right Honorable Bobby Dillon, to deliver a constructive speech not to exceed 8 minutes in length.
I have suspicions about who wrote that. I'm not allowed to talk about it. So, with that said, I have a little bit of an overview before I get into the points that Nick so eloquently brought up. Because he raises an issue which I just find interesting and I actually want to talk about. And it's what I call the black box of the distribution. Because if you look at your sort of paycheck every week and you see where taxes are taken out, you see that Social Security taxes are itemized, they're taken out, you know exactly how much you're paying for them. However, with regard to your federal income tax, they don't tell you what proportion of it is spent on roads, what proportion of it is spent on welfare, what proportion is spent on the elderly, or what proportion is spent on like space exploration. And I think there's a very important reason that you have that distinction. The distinction between a policy which only benefits you, because that money is going to be benefiting you eventually, like Social Security, and a policy which can conceivably benefit somebody else. Because I think when people know that the money that they are spending will not benefit them, will definitionally benefit somebody else, I think that makes them less likely necessarily to vote for it. So they say on their side of the house, so what they say on their side of the house is that when people know that like their property taxes are just like going to be benefiting them, that basically what they're saying on their side of the house is that if people know like what their money is going toward, they're going to vote to try to help out these other kids. They're going to try to help out people in other school districts. I think that if you're going to have redistribution at all, if you're going to support the wealthy people in society, taking care of people in poor school districts, you can't tell them this dollar is going to a kid that's not yours, this dollar is going to be going to somebody else. And I think at that point that you have to have this kind of black box of redistribution. You have to sort of take it out of the general fund, because these people are not going to be willing to just vote for a person who says raise money for other kids. They're going to have to vote. They're going to want to like vote for people who are generally in favor of education, but not necessarily redistribution. No thanks. So the second thing they talk about here, the first thing they talk about here is local control. And they say that it's good to have an itemized budget and that accountability is good. I want to point out that this is totally not mutually exclusive with our case. We are all in favor of accountability, and we are all in favor of an itemized budget with regard to how the money in each school district is spent. We are not in favor, however, of individuals being able to vote on how much money should be collected. That's the real distinction in our side of the house, and it's a distinction I think that they fail to get. Because they say, well, everyone has access to this money, and if people really want to spend money on their children, they'll just raise taxes. But I think it ignores the dilemma that Justin gives you in his case. Not all communities have access to this money. Not all communities can vote feasibly to raise taxes. So it's true that if you proposed a budget in a poor area that would propose more money for teachers, more money for textbooks, they would absolutely want to vote for it, but the money just isn't there. You're going to end up screwing over poor rural farmers who have huge amounts of land but can't pay property taxes on it because they don't have the rural capital. If you go to a place like my hometown, you are constantly in a situation where you have to choose between either hurting local farmers, hurting the people who don't have a lot of money by raising taxes, and hurting the schools by not voting for enough money. Now, if there were always a solution, and we thought that the school boards could reach it, maybe you could trust the school boards to make that determination. But in many cases, there is no solution. The money simply isn't there because it's locked up in these wealthy, affluent areas. So it's true that maybe if everyone were equally wealthy and everyone had the ability to choose, how much money do my kids get, maybe you could go with their side of the house. But these income inequalities simply exist. There are rich communities and poor communities, and they give you no solvency on their side of the house for these poor communities to potentially get the money. That's really bad. We're all in favor of accountability, but not with regard to voting for how much money is spent when some people don't have the option to vote for more money. The second thing that they say under this is that some people vote for high taxes because they see that it benefits their children. Again, I've already responded to this. Some people simply don't have the option for voting for those higher taxes, at the point at which it's going to be rendering farming in their area totally infeasible, or it's going to be undermining their local businesses. So I think that it is certainly good that some people want to support education, but I think that they should use their own private support for education if they choose to do so. If a wealthy person wants to give supplemental funding to their school to donate money to build a stadium, donate money to build a football field, donate money for textbooks, we're certainly in favor of that. What we're not in favor of is using the instrument of the state as a mechanism by which the wealthy can use their wealth to perpetrate their influence through further generations. You should not use the instrument of the state as this form of reverse welfare by which, the wealthier your parents are, the more money you get for your education. That's not good. I'll take you back on this. The second thing they talk about is that money is not the only problem. Some people simply don't care, and that if the rich are already redistributively helping the poor, they're not going to donate to charity, and they're not going to help them out in any other fashion. So it is true that money is not the only problem in American schools. What we're saying on our side of the house is, firstly, money is one serious problem for a lot of school districts, and something that we can absolutely correct on our side of the house. The second thing we will say is that a lack of money makes problems worse. When you have a problem with truancy, when you have a problem with security, when you have a problem in your school that you need to take care of, not having the resources to handle it effectively makes those problems worse. In addition, having extra money helps you to solve some of those problems. As Justin said, if the parents aren't as involved, you can have after-school programs, and you can spend more money on education and textbooks to ensure that these kids do get a chance. The whole point is that not that money is the root of all of the problems, just that money is a very effective thing, and shortchanging people is simply not something that the state could vote for. They also say the rich aren't going to help the poor if they're already helping them through their taxes. The rich are already helping the poor through their taxes, to the point at which we have welfare and any other redistributive benefit. I think it's their burden to show that this benefit should not be redistributive. I don't think they can do it. So with that said, let's talk about the things that we bring up on this. The first thing we say is the right to equal treatment under the law. And we say that we obviously defend equal rights under the law. The government can't treat people differently with regard to freedom of speech, with regard to due process of law. But we feel that this right to equal protection also extends to equal access to benefits. That it's not fair that the government just arbitrarily spends more money educating some children than it spends educating others. And that if you had to make a determination, the determination that is made in the status quo is terrible. That the richer your parents are, the more money gets spent on your education. We feel that's a form of reverse redistribution, which is something not acceptable. No, thank you. They say that you can use your own means. They say that it's legitimate for wealthy people to have their children have a better education. That is partially true in the sense that we allow them to use their own fiscal resources to support their kids' education. If they're getting tutors, if they want to have some kind of after-school program that they can themselves pay for, that's fine. We feel it's illegitimate for the state to use its own coercive power to tax to support such a structure. That the state has an obligation to, with regard to its own access to benefits, to provide equally for all people. It should not be the instrument by which the plutocrats benefit their kids. Allow them to use some other instrument to do so. They also talk about federal grants, and they say federal grants can solve all of these problems. But I find it very specious that on their side of the house, they're basically going to be keeping schools unequal, like there are in the status quo, and then using the federal grants to kind of even them out by giving the poor schools more money. Because if they really feel that's the most effective policy, why not make them equal in the first place and then equally distribute the federal grants, or distribute them on a need-based basis? I think it's really silly for them to assume that the federal government should redistribute rather than the state government. They've given you no solvency for that, no reason why that is the more effective means to do so. We talk about cycles of poverty, how if you are poor now, your children will likely be poor, and how it is so difficult for communities to break out of these cycles because they don't have the resources. They grant them and they say that they're true, but there are other problems that exist. But the fact is, at the point at which they give you no mechanism for solvency, no way of even hoping to break these cycles of poverty, I think you have to go with our side of the house, because the worst case scenario on our side of the house, the worst case scenario is that these kids at least have some chance to break out of poverty, and you know that the government itself is not keeping you poor. The government is not an agent of the powerful to oppress the weak. I think that even if this is not effective, even if it doesn't change education at all, simply sending the message that it is not the role of the government to keep the weak down, but it is a social leveling force, is a powerful one and one we should send. The second thing we talk about is how the mechanisms are unfair. So School boards are not equipped to make this decision, and often there's simply not a good decision to be made. They say sure they can, but quite honestly, I think it's really difficult to ask a person that just because they wanted to be involved in setting curriculum, just because they wanted to be involved in deciding how money was spent, expecting them to have some kind of mastery of how you should collect taxes, what a farmer can or cannot pay, and what is going to be bad for the long-term economic health of the community as property taxes often impact. They say sure they can, we say often they aren't able to, and it might even discourage good school board members who can actually reform their schools from actually running. We tell you that the state is better at assessing these things. They say the school is better at assessing their needs, but I don't think the school is necessarily better at collecting the resources at the point at which those resources don't exist. Sure, everyone knows what the money should be spent on. Fine, let them decide what it's spent on, not how much money comes from the school. The last thing we talk about is bad incentives. We say it's easy to influence local elections, and that the wealthy are likely to flee from these areas and try to go to places where the property taxes are low so they can send their kids to a public school. They say, well, these people will just run for state offices. But the whole point of our argument was that it's very easy to influence the local elections, and it's much less easy for moneyed interests to influence a state election. And the point at which it is just the entire state you're voting for, then some small local interest who just wants low property taxes because it's good for his business, isn't as able to buy a school board member, isn't as able to influence the result of the election. We think that leads to less corruption on our side of the house. But also, they just don't understand this argument about the wealthy fleeing. We're not saying they're going to stay in the community and just send their kids to private school. We're saying they're going to flee the community.
Finish your sentence, please.
Okay. What we're saying is that the wealthy people, if they know they're sending kids to a private school, will go to a community where it has the lowest possible property taxes, will vote for even lower property taxes, and then try to remove themselves as much of the burden as possible. That's an argument that we made. That's an argument they didn't respond to, and it's for all these reasons we were
The House thanks the member of government and calls upon the member of the loyal opposition, the Right Honorable Dennis Reed, to close the constructive period of the round with speech not to exceed 8 minutes in length.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and everyone for being here. I want to make it clear what the decision we have to make in this round is. Because we don't necessarily tell you that these schools we have to screw over poor schools. Because we do give you a mechanism to help these poor schools. A mechanism that I believe is already in place in the status quo, where the federal government does give block grants to help out poorer schools. What we're sort of arguing about is whether these local districts should have the choice of how much funding to give to their school. And I think that's an important distinction. If we can give you some method to have some sort of minimum standard, but also continue to empower the local school districts to actually choose the level of funding that they need, I think that's the best solution to the problem, and not just the blanket solution that they give on their side of the house. I'm going to respond to Rob's sort of, observation first. He talks about the black box of redistribution, and how people aren't necessarily going to vote for things if they don't know that it's coming for, if they don't know that it's going to benefit them. Well, it seems to me, and I hope I'm not misunderstanding this, that that's an argument for our side, right? Because at the point where you're saying that if people are going to vote for things that don't directly benefit them, you'll have a far greater chance of actually voting for things if you vote for our side, because they see the direct benefits, so you're going to get more funding in schools. Let's go on to Nick's points. The first thing we talk about is how local control is good, and how different schools have different needs. Rob says, well, we don't object to different schools deciding how much to spend on each thing. We object to the itemized budget. But that doesn't, we object to them deciding how much to spend. That didn't really respond to the point. What we said was, different communities have different educational needs. They might need more money in the absolute sense, not just more money on each certain, not just more money on each certain thing. But I also would say that if you allow the state to do this, if you allow the state to decide how much money to spend in each community, you're sort of de facto constraining their choices on what to spend on each thing. They don't have many choices overall. No, thank you, please. You didn't take that.
No, I did. He did.
We also think that you just have a choice to select what kind of education level you want. Say you want to send your kid to a private school. You might want to move to a district which has less funding for public schools. It's a choice we think you have on your side of the house. If you're someone who's single and you want to move to a district that has very, very low property taxes, we don't think you should move to a district. We don't think you should be forced to pay for the high property taxes that other people pay for. We think the benefits should be chosen by people, and people should have the choice of what level of property taxes they want in their community. Also, so what they say in response to this is that this is going to hurt local communities. rural areas, because somehow they're getting screwed in this case. Remember what I said before, you can always give some sort of federal funding to provide some sort of minimum standard. The other thing we talked about, the second point, is that people will vote for higher taxes, what I talked about before. Their problem is that there are some people who just don't have the option to do so. Some people who can't raise taxes any further. Again, I'm going to respond to this by saying we have a method. We have a method to increase funding. I'm not going to defend screwing over the poor in all cases. That would be pretty easy. No, thank you.
Come on.
You didn't take any of mine. I'm sorry. Like the other thing, and here's the interesting thing that he says in response to this as well. He says, it's okay. I'm okay with people donating a new stadium to these rich schools. I'm okay with rich people, say, pulling together funds and putting it into their schools. The problem with that argument, Mr. Speaker, is that they're okay with inequality in some sense. But so that sort of drives away their whole philosophy if we want inequality across the board, because they're okay with rich people contributing more money to schools. So let's say, just hypothetically, a group of rich people, say, in a town, got together and formed, say, a school board and decide to contribute money, we'll call them taxes, to the school board to raise their level of education in their community. Wouldn't that be kind of the same as what we're talking about on our side of the house? That's why we're providing some sort of minimum standard. I think their entire philosophy falls at that point. The third point we talk about is money isn't the only determinant. They say having money is a solution, it is a major factor. However, it didn't respond to Nick's example. Sometimes inner city schools actually have very, very high levels of funding because they have very, very high levels of need, and people realize this and they contribute high levels of money to these schools. But that doesn't fix these schools. What needs to be fixed is the internal problems with the community, problems of families being broken up, all that other sorts of bad stuff that you need to deal with first before fixing the money. Again, also, this is another example of why their case is really bad. Because recognize these inner city schools do need a lot more money than the suburban schools, so you might want to give more money to the inner city schools than no thank you. Again, you didn't take any of mine. I'd really like to take yours, but I only have to be fair. The first point, let's go back. I'm going back case side. The first point they talk about is rights, equal treatment. You should have equal access to benefits. Again, remember what I said in response to their point. You're still allowing rich people to do this. Also, you're still allowing rich people to go to private schools, so you're not really having any equalized opportunity. So now it's the very, very rich that get to get these benefits, and not just there might be some sort of benefit. But also remember, if you believe the argument that the rich sort of control the power structure, perhaps what the rich might do is vote for a very, very low taxation and actually contribute more money on their end to actually increase the education for them. Have some sort of voluntary giving program, or just send their kids to private schools and continue to screw over the poor public schools. They say it's illegitimate for the government to do that. The government can't be an agent of the power of powerful people. We tell you again how the government can still be an agent of the powerful people, even under their plan. That's a bad thing. Also, I think the government can't. If the government is an agent of the power, I don't think there's some specific harm. I think we've shown you why the government isn't helping rich people necessarily in this sense. They also say it's illegitimate to use the state to enforce this, to enforce inequality. However, I don't think the state is enforcing anything. It's simply letting local communities decide what level of funding they want to do. On their side, they're the ones that are sort of forcing local communities to take a certain amount and to educate their kids with a certain amount. The second thing they talk about is methods, and how school boards and local officials don't understand. They say property taxes are very difficult things to understand. They didn't take macroeconomic classes or anything. However, I don't think property taxes are as complicated as setting the federal income tax, because you know your community. You are, after all, a person who pays those income taxes. You know how these things affect you. It's not that complicated when you get onto a local level, an individual level. It's much easier to understand. Also, I think, again, I'm sorry. Absolutely, I think it's just, I also think they can understand in terms of how much money the school actually needs. I think it's more important for them to decide how much money they need to educate their children properly. That's a more important decision for them. So that's the decision that they're going to make, and they're going to base the taxing decision on other things. They say our federal funding solution isn't all that great because it's not better. I think we've shown you how it's better, in that our system just gives you more flexibility, gives people the right to decide, gives people the right to flexibility, and also solves for the inequality problems that they present on their side of the house. The last thing they say is the bad incentives that exist. It's very easy to influence local elections with moneyed interests. Recognize that it's still easy to influence state elections with moneyed interests. But however, I think you'll have less of a chance of influencing these local elections with the sort of private interest, with the moneyed interest, because the people of the community care about the school and won't allow it to go to hell, right? If you really, really care about how if you really, really care about how your kid's going to be educated, you're going to show up at that school board meeting and you're going to vote. You don't have that same option. I think commercials and other abusive advertising can be much more effective on the statewide level. They say they're going to take kids, people are going to take kids out of their schools. I think that happens on their side of the house if you provide a very low minimum standard of budgeting. I think the same harms exist. We're very proud to oppose.
Thanks to the member of opposition for his eloquent remarks, and we call upon the leader of opposition to begin the rebuttal period with a speech not to exceed 1 minute, reminding him that while new examples are welcome, new arguments will not be accorded equal treatment by any individual.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, members of the panel, everyone for a good round. I want to talk about 3 things. First, I'm going to talk about solving for inequality, then promoting more money into the system, and thirdly, spending more money wisely. Or spending money more wisely, I guess is the correct English way to say that. First thing, solving for inequality. Look, their point throughout this round is, it sucks to go to a crappy school. They're right. It sucks to go to a crappy school. I know, I go to BU, right? Like, I understand those things. Oh, I'm just kidding, guys. But yeah, it does suck to go to a crappy school. But being a crappy school is not dependent upon the amount of money you have put into the system. It's based on a lot of factors that are not necessarily going to be changed by adding money to the system. Consider that the crappy Boston public schools have more money per student than a lot of good public schools in rural communities or suburban communities. It's not based on money, but based on other factors. No matter how much money you give to the public school in downtown Compton, you're not going to make them a great school. You're not going to make them as good as the private school Dennis went to, right? So if that's the case, why should we do it? They say, at least we could have some sort of marginal impact, right? The problem with just having a marginal impact on these schools is that you then deter the rich people in society, the affluent people, from feeling like they have a further burden. We tell you there are other ways that the affluent can help out the more poor communities, besides just giving their schools money. But insofar as they feel like they've met their burden by redistributing their money to those schools, they're not going to feel the same burden to go out and do other things for them. Also, we say that it's just sometimes a waste of money when a school can't use the resources as efficiently, and so we get less efficient education overall. But the second thing I want to talk about is promoting more money into the system. Perhaps you feel more money is good. Let's talk about why they're not getting it. We'd say that when people vote in local elections, they can see the direct impact of the money they put into the system. This is the standard we've upheld throughout the round. I know that my child is getting a better teacher in their school because I voted for more money into the system, or they're having more violins to be handed out, or whatever else it is, more field trips. That means that I see the direct impact and I'm willing to spend more money on contributing to that school system. If the money's getting redistributed, I get less value for my contribution to tax dollars, and so I'm less willing to contribute to money. So when I vote on taxes at the statewide level, I'm less likely to vote for higher taxes. We also say that, look, even if there are going to be some inadequacies in this, we do have federal grants to check the system. Rob says, why not just even it out before the federal system? Because we get less money that way, Rob. That's the point of our case. We get all of the federal money plus more money being in through state elections. Or through local elections for school boards. And we also have better control of the money, something we talked about in my third point. But the really interesting thing that came up in the MG speech is this idea that people can just donate money to the school anyway, and they're okay to that. I think Dennis has already mocked this better than I can. That's our side of the case. That's a school board. That's local elections. That's what we're defending. The third and final thing I want to talk about is spending your money wisely. Because however much money you have in the system, it's not worth much if you don't spend it efficiently, spend it wisely, and get the most out of it. The problem is, when you have state control of the funding, they give them, according to their case at least, the same amount per student. Each school, however, has different needs that need to be met. Now, there's 2 parts to this. The first is a sort of itemized list. We need these certain things. They say the state can have a certain itemized list too, right, but they can't manage it as efficiently because they don't see the direct impacts the way I talked about before. But they missed the major point I talked about, that schools actually have different needs. The need is not based necessarily upon the amount of kids in the school. This means that if we distribute money purely by the number of kids in each class, we don't get the right amount of money in each school. Some have more than they need, others have not enough. This is a problem for them because it means that the whole system becomes worse. Look, we don't know exactly what those needs are. We can't tell you in the debate round, but who does know? Who knows what each school needs? The local community, the parents who send their kids there, the store owners in the town. That's why they vote, because they understand the school better than the state, better than the other voters in the state, better than us, and better than Cornell. That's why we need local funding.
The House thanks the Leader of Opposition, and we call upon the Prime Minister to close the round with a speech not to exceed 5 minutes in length, reminding him, of course, of all the same stuff.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and everyone around, and friends on up for great advocates. With this in mind, I think that it's interesting, like the kind of picture that they paint for us, and this becomes even more clear in LOR, where they're like, look, this is what they're giving you on SideGov. This is their like purported version of errors. Schools will never have the right amount of money because every school needs a very different amount of money for each student. And even though we said in case construct that you can adjust for local variations in the cost of things like utilities, or in Nick's example, fixing the roof because of a very localized issue, I think that's taken care of. But they also are like, look, we give you itemized budgets. So can we. Rob said this in MG. There's plenty of transparency in state budgets. So this is another of their like dark side arguments. But then they do this like real paradox where they can't decide whether parents care or parents don't care. Because sometimes parents know what's best for their community. That's what Nick closes his LOR on, which was a great speech. But he closes, it was good, not as good as us. But he's like, look, parents care, and they care about the community. But then we get a lot of arguments in MO about how people might want lower taxes, and they do vote, and they do get involved in elections. So they just have to move somewhere and then vote for lower taxes if those taxes are lower. Well, what's the problem with this? First of all, I think it very much belies the fact that there aren't uniform sort of interests in people, and allowing them to vote on a very local level makes it very much able to be influenced by local corruptive factors, an argument that they never responded to, that it's much easier to buy off a local school board election than it is to influence a state election. And I'll get into the local-state divide a little bit more later. But I think this is an inconsistency in the type of argumentation that they give us. So with this in mind, how do we actually help schools? Well, the first question I'd ask, and they sort of have like tried to argue about this, and if I was judging this round, I would not give a lot of credence to this argument, which is the argument that money doesn't really matter. Like sometimes you can have a lot more money, and like, it doesn't help the schools, and that's fine. And we accept that, and like I said in case construct, this isn't a perfect case. I think people in debate sometimes very much get hung up on, do you have a perfect case? But as a matter of policy, we think that this can very much deal in a very substantive way with a lot of the problems that schools experience. I give a number of examples of construct. I talked about giving after-school programs, which can help, just like they said, when the community doesn't want to be involved. By the way, I'd hate to think what happens when the community doesn't want to be involved and then goes to the polls on their side of the house. But I would tell you but Rob gives you a lot of other arguments about access to resources and giving people at least a level of baseline. So I think this is particularly relevant for us. I think money does matter. So at that point, how do we give you greater amounts of funding? Well, we give you a number of reasons. First of all, we discussed the tax paradox. Oftentimes, there is just no way out in terms of determining what the appropriate tax policy is without more money. There's a finite amount of money in local communities. Raising taxes makes people's financial situation entirely unviable, like a farmer who might own a lot of property but doesn't have a lot of capital to give to taxes, or lowering taxes but then acting to the detriment of schools. They make arguments about communities knowing what's best. But every community, even if they always knew what's best, knows that at some point you might run out of money, and if you can't raise taxes because it's going to screw people over, you have to bite the bullet and have bad schools. We don't want to put people in that situation because we increase the overall amount of funding in schools by raising everyone to a baseline level. So I think that's very much relevant as well. So we give you greater overall funding in that regard. But the other thing is, and I think that I made this argument a minute ago, is the argument that we get in MO, which is somebody is going to move to a community that has lower taxes, and they also tell you that people are going to vote in their own interest, which might be lower taxes. So at that point, on their side of a community with a lot of self-interested people, elderly people, or people with no one in school, or maybe somebody like what Amanda Whiting is going to be as a parent, which just hates her kids, and she doesn't want to pay more money for them. Sorry, Amanda, it's true, though. Yeah. But at that point, this person's going to vote and screw over the rest of the community. Because so few people vote in school board elections, a small number of people wind up setting the policy for a lot more. But the other thing is, in terms of greater amounts of funding, they're like, look, guys, you could have this type of pandering or corruption on the state level. Well, that might be true. Certainly there is corruption. There are interested politics when it comes to state elections. But it's much more difficult to win a state election on a single platform like lowering your community's school taxes, as opposed to influencing a local election, where a small donation monetarily could have a much larger impact than in a gubernatorial election. Wait a minute. Then they retreat a little. They're like, you know what? That's not entirely our argument. Our argument really is, local schools, they need to be able to spend their money, things like that. They need to understand what they need money for. First of all, they give us this entirely non-mutually exclusive argument that federal grants could cover this. First of all, federal grants don't go to individual schools. In case construct, I said they are block grants given to states which allocate money. So that's number one. But number two, let's assume that they're right for a moment. Their argument is some greater power which collects taxes in a very indirect way should be giving money to schools to improve them in cases where they don't have enough money. I think you should vote for us if you believe that. I believe that. I would vote for us, but it goes on a much larger scale. The disparity on their side is you get all these localized harms, like people voting to lower taxes, and in those cases where federal block grants aren't available or aren't enough, then they're really fucked. But the other thing that they sort of bring up is this private donation, and Dennis thinks he's got a winner here, and he's like kind of funny. He says, like, look, private donations. They could all consent to private donations. We're just going to call it taxes in a community. All right, a number of responses to this. This is a very silly argument. First of all, understand that they are voluntary, not coercive, and I think that's very important. And because of that, you don't have the moral hazard of not being able to raise or lower taxes in the family farmer example. But the other thing is very much misunderstanding the point of welfare economics. The point is not to make everyone equal. We don't mind if some schools have a relatively much greater money than others. It's increasing the baseline in absolute terms. That's what this case does. That's the opportunity that it offers you. That is not something that they have on their side of the house, and that's why private donations are unique. So in my last 30 seconds here, in my last 10 seconds here, I just want to very quickly discuss some rights. Because on their side of the house, they do bring up rights. People have a right to spend their money as they see fit. They have a right to collect their money as they see fit. On our side of the house, it's equal distribution of benefits. They never give you an impact to that, except somebody might be pissed off in a libertarian sense. But our impact is that families are stuck in a cycle of poverty that they can't get out of. So in terms of weighing the rights against one another, I think we've clearly won the day. Mr. Speaker and members of the panel, we propose.